It's been 84 years since we had the last LG TV on the channel. Thanks to Christie's Goonie-like attitude, I'm finally getting to bring you LG's latest pocketbook-friendly OLED TV, the B4. Now, I know we usually review bigger displays, but if a 65-inch is all you have room for, this one's for you. If our setup looks a little different, that's because I mounted the B4 to the Canvas loudspeaker, which is a soundbar-like smart speaker that can also be used as a floor stand or a wall mount for any TV up to 77 inches. I connected the LG to the Canvas speaker using a single HDMI cable connected to each product's HDMI ARC eARC port. And this let me use the included LG remote to control power and volume on the Canvas without any additional setup or programming. Now, the first time you power up the B4, you're going to be guided through a series of steps that include prompts to download the LG ThinQ app and procedures to connect the TV to your home's network. LG's built-in operating system, webOS, it gives you all of the usual streaming apps like Netflix, YouTube, and more. And I gotta say, the day-to-day livability of any TV's built-in operating system at this point, pretty universal. That said, the B4's webOS is frustratingly slow. I mean, every input from the included Magic Remote takes a second or two before the command is actually carried out on screen. Switching to a third-party streamer like an Apple TV 4K or a media player from Xidu demonstrates just kind of how sluggish the webOS really is. Maybe faster processing is reserved for LG's higher-end models. I don't know. Whatever it is, I would go with a third-party device like an Apple TV, a Roku, or an NVIDIA Shield. I think you're going to be a lot happier with the streaming experience long-term if you do. But not so fast. There is one caveat to using a third-party device like an Apple TV. LG really wants you to use their Magic TV remote, so anytime you change your source component, it will prompt you to program the Magic Remote to control the new device. If you aren't a fan of the Magic Remote like I am, the LG will occasionally still ask you to confirm this decision. And declining the prompt and blocking the prompt, it's not going to stop LG from asking occasionally. I gotta say, I haven't encountered this with other TV brands, and I wish there was a way to truly disable it. But let's get to the good stuff. First, you gotta know, the LG does have 3 factory profiles that meet the standard of calibrated, but the B4 launches in its energy-saving, aka Eco Picture profile. Like most energy-saving profiles, the LG's isn't accurate. There's a noticeable blue bias, which means the LG's grayscale and primary colors, they all push cool. Measuring the profile revealed a delta E of 16 for grayscale and 13 for color, which means the LG, at least in its energy profile, is far from calibrated. Remember, for an accurate image, one that does not require additional calibration, we want to see a delta E of 3 or less. The standard profile has even more of a bias towards blue, putting up a delta E of 16 for the grayscale and 12 for color, and I didn't even need to measure Vivid to know that it was the worst of the 3. So unless you love a cool blue image, I would avoid the B4's energy, standard, and Vivid profiles. Moving on to LG's more accurate profile, starting with Cinema, which is going to look immediately warmer in overall tone. If you give your eyes a few minutes to adjust that yellowish tint you may notice in white tones, it's going to pass. Cinema measured a delta E of 2.7 for its grayscale and 1.6 for color, meaning it meets the definition of calibrated from the factory and shouldn't require any additional adjustment. My usual go-to, filmmaker mode, it actually measured a little worse, and in my test, it didn't rise to the standard of calibrated from the factory with a delta E of 4 for grayscale and 2.2 for color. But switching to either of the ISF picture profiles brought everything back in line with a delta E of 1.9 for grayscale and 1.4 for color. The most notable difference between Cinema and the ISF modes are in the brightness levels and just slight variation in each profile's gamma curve. Cinema crushes blacks a little bit more than what I observed with the ISF profiles. Regardless, for best picture quality with true-to-life contrast, including being able to render absolute black and the most organic colors, use the Cinema or ISF picture profiles. If you follow my recommendations, I think you can skip professional calibration on the B4, but to see just how good the LG could get, I use my light meter and SpectraCal software to perform a full calibration. Post-calibration, the LG had a delta E of around 1 for both grayscale and color. The difference before and after calibration was not night and day, so unless you're just, a hardcore videophile, I don't believe professional calibration would be worth your time, let alone your money. The B4 is impressive straight out of the box. Now, if the B4 is your first OLED, do not be surprised at this TV's lack of brightness. OLEDs are typically noticeably less bright than LED or mini LED backlit displays. While LG makes brighter OLEDs, they do cost more. In my opinion, I think we've all gotten a little bit obsessed with brightness figures or nits. More often than not, the usable brightness of any display, regardless of its make, is often less than the reported figures, and in some cases, a lot less. I started off by using SDR test patterns to measure the LG's brightness. The B4 reached between 300 and 450 nits depending on settings. When you set the B4's peak brightness and auto dynamic contrast to their maximum, brightness improves. Though, word of warning, the higher you set these two settings, the more you're going to notice two things: the processor's inability to keep pace with sudden changes in illumination, the B4's ABL or auto brightness limiter, or you might even notice both happening at the same time. Keeping these settings to low or off, it helps, though you are sacrificing some maximum brightness by doing this. Now, the LG can play back HDR content, including HLG, HDR10, and Dolby Vision. Sadly, there is no HDR10 Plus support here, but as you would expect, brightness does increase when viewing HDR content. Doing peak runs, I was able to measure a brightness in the mid 600 nit range, with real-world brightness falling a little bit closer to 500 nits. When viewing some HDR content, the B4's ABL can be even more aggressive. For best results, I strongly recommend practicing moderation with these settings. I've seen brighter HDR performance, especially from our recently reviewed TCL QM8, but all things considered, the LG always produced a natural and just more true-to-life looking image, just not a blazingly bright one. The B4 uses LG's A8 AI-powered processor. While this isn't the brand's flagship, with some content, you may start to notice the lesser processing power, especially if you start to compare it to more of Sony's advanced or current displays. The B4's processor is less of an issue, one you may not even notice when watching native 4K content via streaming, physical media, or gaming. But when you switch to HD Blu-rays or heavily compressed broadcasts in 720p, the LG falls a little short. Side-by-side comparisons with our reference Sony X90L, which is an LED TV, by the way. They reveal a notably softer image on the LG when viewing HD or compressed content. And it's even more noticeable with finer details or text like the lower thirds of a sports broadcast. Speaking of sports, fast motion, it also just wasn't as fluid through the B4 as it was through the Sony. Don't get me wrong, the LG's overall image and color fidelity is exceptional and comparable to the Sony. It's an OLED, so you would expect it to have better contrast and black levels, which it does. But when it comes to scaling and motion performance, the Sony really puts a spotlight on the LG's just slower processor. Keeping our focus on our Sony X90L LG matchup, light uniformity and control is one area where the LG simply outperformed our reference Sony. Obviously, OLED TVs use a different technology than LED TVs to illuminate their panel, and OLEDs usually result in having less blooming, and that's just because they don't have to control backlighting or zones the way LED TVs do. The LG also beat the Sony in edge-to-edge light uniformity, resulting in little to no DSC or vignetting on the B4, which is a common worry for fans of LED TVs. The B4's off-axis viewing with respect to light uniformity and even color rendering is really good, and it's even better than the more expensive Samsung OLED, and it's a lot better than anything I've ever experienced from an LED-based display. But the B4 isn't perfect off-axis, but it is respectable. If you or your guests are going to be forced to sit off to the side, the B4, it might be a good TV to consider. Just keep in mind that the B4 may not have all of the brightness it needs to overcome all ambient light conditions or reflections, and reflections that can be made worse when sitting off axis. So you may want to avoid installing the B4 in super bright rooms or near a window. Now, the LG has 4 HDMI 2.1 compatible ports, complete with support for gaming features like VRR, ALLM, NVIDIA G-Sync, and AMD FreeSync. I gamed on the LG with my PS5 in full 4K with no issues, and that was with and without HDR enabled. First-person shooter games like Call of Duty, buttery smooth, played back at 120 frames per second. I may have the reflexes of a panda, but I couldn't detect any excessive lag when gaming on the LG. And while my choice in gaming content, I get it, may not be for everyone, but I have to say, playing The Last of Us 2 Remastered on the LG looked amazing and is one of the better gaming experiences I've had all year. Now, Now, we haven't had the good fortune to review Samsung's latest crop of OLED TVs, so I'm going to have to go on the Wayback Machine and use our review of Samsung's S95C for this comparison. The LG is competitive, and for the money you'll save, it's probably worth a look. While the Samsung is brighter, like the LG, it also suffers from aggressive ABL at times. The LG's out-of-the-box image is more accurate, and it has better colors. The Samsung has better processing, though, which should pay dividends, especially if you like watching lesser signals. Still, if you keep your content current or you're looking for a more gaming-centric display, you're gonna save a little bit of money by going with the LG. Our reference OLED, Sony's A95K, it is still a great TV, but it is getting a little bit long in the tooth. When comparing their everyday performance, Sony and LG both have true-to-life contrast, natural color rendering, and good edge-to-edge uniformity. Where the Sony surpasses the LG, though, is in brightness, better processing, and scaling. One of the LG's biggest downsides is its aggressive ABL. Now, the Sony is almost flawless in this department. That said, the LG was actually a little bit more accurate out of the box, if you can believe it. I'm not ready to replace our Sony, the A95K. It still works for us, even though it is now, I think, maybe a generation or two old. But its Google operating system is lightning quick by comparison. Now, the A95K, it's not as easy to come by, plus it's still commanding a hefty price at close to $3,000. So if you have $3,000 in your budget, then you can do better than the B4. But if you don't, the LG is a great budget-friendlier option. And sticking with Sony, compared to the newer A95L OLED that we reviewed at the beginning of the year, the LG is just outmatched. But at more than double the price, this should be expected. If you want to leave no doubt and know that you have one of the best OLED TVs currently available, go ahead, dig deep and invest in the Sony. For those who aren't brand loyal or who are okay with the display that gets you, say, 70% of the way to perfection, but for less, you might want to consider the B4. So besides a laggy processor and an auto brightness limiter that can get a little bit aggressive when trying to max out the B4's brightness watching either SD or HDR content, I gotta say the LG has a lot to offer, especially at its more wallet-friendly price. So pair the B4 with a third-party streamer like an Apple TV and go ahead and bypass the built-in webOS, feed this TV a steady diet of native 4K movies or gaming content, and you may start to ask yourself, who needs anything more? So that's it. That is now my take on LG's entry-level OLED, the B4. What do you guys think? What do you guys think of LG's OLED? Are they still king of the hill? Has Sony kind of taken over? Or are you just kind of like OLED's played out and it's all about mini or micro LED? Really like to know. I think it would be a really interesting conversation. And if you have any questions or I missed a comparison, go ahead, you know the drill, leave them down in the comments below because you never know, could end up on Friday's Unplugged where we're going to get to hear what Christy thought of the LG. And believe me, I think she has a few things that she noticed right away. Anyway, until then, if you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up, like, and subscribe. Go ahead and ring that bell so that you're notified when new videos come out. If you use any of the links that Christy's left for you down below, know that that's a great way that you've continued to show your support for this channel and the work that we both do here. And both of us thank you very much for doing that. Follow me on Instagram at Recovering Audiophile, and that is it for us today. So remember, the only person who has to like the sound or sight of your system is you. So happy listening, watching. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you Friday with a brand new video. Bye.